Just Netanyahu. It's blamed on Netanyahu constantly, but it is the national mood. If you take a look at polls, the national mood is shifting very far to the ultranationalist right. It's paranoid, it's hysterical, it's irrational, and part of it is that we got to crush any dissent. We have to crush any attempt to question the legitimacy and magnificence of what we're doing. This change in the country in the last few years is dramatic and very frightening. They're really kind of circling the wagons, kind of reminiscent of white South Africa. And that's, Netanyahu happens to be, he's riding on that wave, but he's not creating.
Yeah, pretty much after every act of Israeli aggression and pretty much any human disaster, on the news you hear them throw out the term international communities calling for independent investigation. I'm just wondering who these investigators are, if they have any legitimacy at all. I was just wondering if when the international community asks for an independent investigation, who are these investigators and do they have any legitimacy at all?
Most of what's going on doesn't get reported.
Yeah.
But just a couple of days ago, there was an important meeting of the real, what we call the international community, means the United States and anybody who happens to agree with it. That's the international community. Like maybe the whole world disagrees, but then they're against the international community. So, I'm not joking. So take the idea that the international community is calling on Iran to stop enriching uranium. Okay, yeah, you read that everywhere. Exactly who is the international community? Well, it's not the non-aligned countries, which are most of the world. They vigorously support Iran's right to enrich uranium as signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they're not part of the international community. A couple of years ago, I don't know what it's like now, but a couple of years ago, a majority of Americans agreed with them. So the majority of Americans weren't part of the international community. The international community is Washington and whoever happens to be going along with it. Okay? It was pretty striking what happened in the last couple of weeks about this. As you know, I'm sure, Turkey and Brazil made a deal with Iran, which would have was pretty similar to what the U.S. had proposed. They would arrange for uranium to be enriched outside of Iran and then return it to them for medical purposes. Well, the U.S. went berserk. Actually, it turns out that Obama had written a letter to Lula, the president of Brazil, advocating that, probably because he believed that Iran would never agree, and then he'd be able to refer to the letter and say, well, we tried, and they wouldn't do it. But Iran did agree, much to their discomfiture. So the U.S. instantly reacted by ramming through a UN Security Council resolution, which is so weak that China agreed to it instantly, and Russia agreed to it. If you read the terms of the resolution, which is now passed, it's praised here as a great resolution, but if you look at the small print, it does actually almost nothing. About its only effect is to transfer to China even greater control over the resources of Iran by putting some constraints on the West and developing Iran's resources, so they're quite happy with it. Russia's happy with it because it permits them to sell all the arms they want to Iran and so on and so forth. But the U.S. had to ram it through to make the world know who's boss, not Brazil and Turkey. And Turkey is the most important regional power with a long border with Iran, so they're not allowed to be boss. Brazil was the most important country and the most respected country in the South, so they can't be boss. In fact, if you read the New York Times, the headline saying, spot on Lula's legacy or something, it's destroyed his legacy by standing up against the United States. Today there was a report by, quote, some high-level U.S. official saying, we got to do something to make sure that Turkey stays in line, not showing its oats and thinking they can do something independent of the U.S. Well, that's kind of like the mafia. You got to make sure that nobody interferes with your right to control everything. So we'll ram through an almost meaningless UN resolution to block the Turkish-Brazilian initiative, which could have made some progress. I lost track of your question by now. What was the question? Repeat it. Sorry.
Who are these independent investigators?
Oh, the independent investigation. Well, there is the relevant part of the international community is actually there is an Asian security system. It's called CICA. I forget what it stands for, but you can look them up on the net. They had a meeting. It includes most of the Asian states, China, India, all the states in the region, includes Iran, includes Israel. They had a security meeting a couple of days ago, and the meeting decided to call for an international investigation. Well, the rules of the organization require consensus. Okay, and of course Israel didn't agree, so the vote was like 22 to 1 or something. Therefore, there was a separate declaration released, which you can find on the internet, got published, calling for an international investigation. Well, you know, nothing happens unless the boss agrees. The UN, Obama immediately blocked the Security Council, prevented a Security Council resolution calling for an investigation. The Asian Security Organization was just blocked out of the media like not one country. So like it didn't happen, except it did happen. So there's almost unanimous call for an independent investigation, but like everything else, if the U.S. doesn't agree, it doesn't happen. And so we're back to the usual position. The boss decides. I mean, international relations theory doesn't amount to much, in my opinion. I know some of you are studying it. I don't want to insult your field, but frankly, I don't think it amounts to much. There are some principles of international relations, and probably one of the most important principles is that international affairs works like the mafia. Very similar to the mafia. I mean, the Godfather does not accept disobedience. It's too dangerous. A small storekeeper somewhere doesn't pay protection money, can't let him get away with it. Maybe you don't need the money, but if he gets away with it, somebody else will get the idea. Presume the system control erodes. So you don't just send in your goons to get the money from him, because you don't need it anyway. You send them to beat him to a pulp, so everyone gets the idea. That's how international affairs works. Sometimes it's called domino theory or some other thing. But you look at case after case, it constantly works like that. Well, in this case, the U.S. has got to be boss. The principle that controlling Middle East oil gives us substantial control of the world is still true. And nobody else is allowed to horn in. Not Turkey, the most important regional country, not Brazil, the most important country in the South. In fact, if you look at the Security Council vote, the three countries who have anything to do with the Middle East either voted against or abstained. Turkey, Lebanon abstained, can't stand up against the United States. Brazil, of course, voted against. That's the most important voices. Turkey, I think, has a 300-mile border with Iran. There aren't going to be trade constraints unless they agree. But it doesn't matter. We've got to show what it was. So there won't be an international investigation because we say so.
Does it mean anything that Turkey is in NATO? Does it mean anything that Turkey is in NATO and they attacked a Turkish ship, Israel attacked a Turkish ship in international waters?
Well, there is a NATO treaty. And there's a little debate about technically how the ship was flagged. So don't worry about that. But if it was a Turkish flagged ship, as claimed, then there is a NATO treaty, that means it's Turkish territory. Under maritime law, a ship in international waters is part of the territory of the country that flags it. There is a NATO treaty which requires the NATO powers to go to the assistance of any NATO country under attack. So, yes, NATO should have, if treaties meant anything, which of course they don't, the NATO countries led by the United States should have immediately gone to support of the Turkish ship. I mean, if an Iranian ship had attacked a NATO vessel, probably Iran would be blown off the face of the earth.
You just mentioned about this boss who says what can happen and what can't. Sorry, about basically you're saying about the boss in the world, and then he decides, or the United States decides what can happen and what can't. And so it's basically the model of nation states. And then sometimes other times you just speak about economic classes and saying that if you looking at nation states actually isn't being in the real world, you have to look at economic classes instead. How does that work?
That's an interesting question, and Iran is a very striking case, but I'm going to talk about it, so I'm glad you brought it up. There are a couple of principles of international affairs, all of them missing from international relations theory. One principle is the mafia principle. That's a dominant principle of international affairs. Another one is a principle that traces back to Adam Smith. We're supposed to worship Adam Smith, but we're not supposed to read him. That's too dangerous. He's nowhere near the crazed lunatic that is constructed in ideology. He's a pretty sensible guy. So he pointed out, he was talking about England, of course. That's what he cared about. He said that in England, the principal, I'm quoting him, the principal architects of policy are the merchants and manufacturers, people who basically own the economy. So they're the principal architects of government policy, and they make sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, served very well, no matter how grievous the effect on the people of England, and let alone the others who are subject to what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans. He was talking about British atrocities in India. But the merchants, the guys who own the country, they make the policy. That's Adam Smith. That's another principle of international affairs. Well, sometimes the principles of international affairs conflict. And those are interesting cases for the study of policy formation. And actually, Iran is an interesting case. In Iran today, the guys who own the country, the major economic forces, they would be pretty happy to have the United States normalize relations with Iran. For example, the U.S. energy corporations are not delighted that China is picking up all the goodies in Iran. But state policy requires that we give the resources of Iran to China, and over the objection of U.S. energy corporations, which usually have a crucial impact on policy making, especially in the Middle East. Well, that's a conflict between two doctrines, the Mafia doctrine and the Adam Smith doctrine. And in this case, the Mafia doctrine wins. And it's striking, if you look over the history, that there are such cases, and they're very interesting ones, and you find that the very same individuals will make different decisions depending on whether they're running a corporation or running the government. So the same individual could, if the same people who are making the decisions in the case of Iran, let's give it to China, if they were still running their energy corporations or Halliburton or whatever, they'd make the opposite decision. But they now they have an institutional role in state policy, which is different from the role of the CEO of the corporation. The CEO of the corporation has an institutional role. They got to maximize profit. They got to do that. It's a legal requirement, and if they don't do it, they're out, and somebody else comes in and will do it. So that's an institutional role. The role of the same individual, say in the State Department or the Pentagon, is to consider the long-term consequences of policy choices and of the policy choices that are made. That sometimes conflicts with the parochial interests of a particular sector of the economy. So what you get is a conflict, and in this case, the Mafia principle wins. The same individuals who might be running oil companies are deciding that for the long-term goals of controlling the Middle East and making sure nobody else horns in, it's necessary to take positions which in fact harm the energy corporations. It's not the only case. Policy towards Cuba is the same. So in the case of Cuba, it's quite interesting to study. For real international relations theory, these are the things that people should study. In the case of Cuba, for 50 years, ever since Cuban independence, the U.S. has been attacking, punishing the people of Cuba. And we know exactly why. The documents are all out. You have to punish the people of Cuba, and it's Kennedy and Eisenhower and so on. You have to punish the people of Cuba because Cuba isn't following orders. They are carrying out what the Kennedy and Johnson administrations call successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine. No Russians. Monroe Doctrine said we run the hemisphere. Cuba's carrying out successful defiance. We're back to the mafia principle. Can't let a small storekeeper do that. So we got to punish the people of Cuba until they overthrow their government. Meanwhile, the American population is opposed. Like for decades, the large majority of the population has been in favor of normalizing relations. I mean, the world is totally opposed. Just take a look at the UN General Assembly votes every year. You know, it's the world versus the United States, Marshall Islands or something. That's not unusual. But what's striking in this case is that major sectors of American business are opposed. That includes the energy corporations, it includes pharmaceuticals, it includes agribusiness. They all want to normalize relations. Well, you know, those are following the Adam Smith principle. You'd expect them to determine policy. But it's overridden by the mafia principle in that case too. And that's a small storekeeper. It's not like Iran. It's a big storekeeper. Well, okay, that's the way international affairs work. If you really want to study it seriously, those are the cases you should look at. And just if you want to understand U.S. Cold War policy, you should look at what happened in 1990. But those are exactly the topics that are off the agenda. You don't study them in graduate school. There's no academic literature about them. There's no commentary about them. They're just too revealing. So therefore, they've got to be hidden somewhere. But Iran's a very interesting case in that respect, for exactly the reason you mentioned.
And could you reflect?
Incidentally, with the last comment, it's not the first time in the case of Iran. So, for example, in 1953, when the U.S. and Britain overthrew the parliamentary regime and installed the Shah, the U.S. government wanted American oil companies to take 40% of the British concession. That was part of the long-term policy of kind of edging the British out of the Middle East and taking over and turning them into a junior partner. The oil companies didn't want to do it for short-term reasons. It turned out there was a kind of an oil glut at the time, and if they took over the Iranian concession, they would have to reduce liftings in Saudi Arabia, which is much more important for them. The oil's much cheaper, it's got a lot more oil and so on. They didn't want to harm relations. Their short-term parochial interests led them to prefer not taking the British concession. But they were compelled by the federal government, U.S. government, to take it. They were threatened with antitrust penalties and so on, so they followed orders. It's another striking case where the mafia principle, long-term concerns about the control of oil overrode the specific parochial interests of the major architects of policy. Those are interesting cases.
And could you reflect on Britain's role in the mafia system, and are there any conflicting interests with US elites? And secondly, shortly, could Britain and the EU do anything to resolve or to encourage a solution of the Israel-Palestine conflict if they would act more independent from the US?
Britain's an interesting case. Britain, of course, had been the major global power prior to the Second World War, though it was already weaker than the United States economically. During the Second World War, there was kind of a mini-war going on between Britain and the United States over control over Middle East oil, mainly Saudi Arabia. It was understood by the late 30s that that's the real prize, the jewel in the crown. And Britain wanted to keep it, the United States wanted to take it away. So there was a battle going on. We have the documents on it, and of course the United States won. Britain was in dire straits at the time, couldn't do much. So the U.S. took over Saudi Arabia. At the end of the Second World War, the British understood that their role as the international hegemon was essentially over. And the Foreign Office recognized that they would have to be what they called junior partners of the United States. They had no illusions about what the U.S. was up to. They said the U.S. is taking over the world under a pretext of benevolence and so on and so forth, but they're just after power, and we have no choice except to be a junior partner. And we could become independent and join Europe, but they preferred to be a junior partner. And so it continues. Britain has chosen the role of junior partner. That's why it didn't join the Eurozone. It still thinks of itself as an independent actor in world affairs. Of course it's not. But the U.S. treats them with total contempt. And the British just take it, no matter how often they're kicked in the face. Cases like Skyfall in the early 60s, for example. Actually, the most striking case is the 1962 missile crisis. During the missile crisis, U.S. leaders, the Kennedy guys, were making decisions which they understood could lead to the destruction of Europe and the destruction of England. They were pushing things to the point where there might be a Russian retaliation. The Russians could destroy England. They couldn't attack the United States. And they were making decisions with those high probability consequences. They weren't telling the British about it. In fact, Harold Millen, the Prime Minister, didn't know anything about what was going on. He was kind of desperate to find out, but the only thing he knew was what British intelligence could dig up. And right at that point, within the Kennedy administration, one of the senior advisors, who was probably Dean Acheson, defined what he called the special relationship between the U.S. and Britain. He said the special relationship means that Britain is our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner. Well, the British like to hear the fashionable word, but the truth is they're our lieutenant. In fact, that's roughly the difference between Bush and Obama. Bush just told them straight out, you're our lieutenant, get lost. They didn't like that. Europe didn't like that. Obama's kind of nicer rhetoric. He says, yes, you're our partner. When you get back home, you're a lieutenant, and you kick in the face. And Europe's much happier with that. Britain, too. But that's actually, I think that was an accurate description. Europe has choices. Those choices have been a serious concern for U.S. policy since 1950. I mean, the U.S. understood, U.S. planners understood, and of course it wasn't very profound, didn't say the early post-war period, that Europe was going to recover. There would be industrial recovery in Europe. And once they do, they're a power on the scale of the United States. Big economy, just like the U.S., a bigger population, educated population, a lot of advantages. They could become an independent force in world affairs. They could become what was called a third force. It's a big danger. You can't run the world if there's a big independent force. And a lot of efforts were made to prevent that. One of them is called NATO. Part of the goal of NATO was to ensure that Europe would remain a vassal under U.S. control. And again, what happened in 1990 is quite striking in this respect. I mean, if anybody believed the propaganda of the preceding 50 years, then as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, you'd expect NATO to be disbanded. I mean, the propaganda about NATO is, well, it was there to protect us from the Russian hordes. Okay, no more Russian hordes, so let's disband NATO. Is that what happened? NATO expanded, and in quite an interesting way. Gorbachev made an incredible concession. He agreed to let a united Germany, unified Germany, join NATO, hostile military alliance. If you think about it, that's pretty astonishing. I mean, Germany alone had virtually destroyed Russia a couple of times in the past century. And now Gorbachev was agreeing to let a unified Germany join a hostile military alliance led by the world's superpower. Why did he do it? Because there was a quid pro quo. He did it with an agreement with the Bush administration that NATO would not expand, the phrase was, would not expand 1 inch to the east. It would not include East Germany, and obviously nothing beyond. Well, Gorbachev was naive. That was a gentleman's agreement. The Bush administration was careful never to put it on paper. We have a detailed record of this by now, detailed scholarly record. It's quite interesting. Gorbachev made the stupid error of thinking he could make a gentleman's agreement with the United States. It's pretty stupid. And the United States had the slightest intention of living up to it, and of course didn't. So immediately NATO expanded to the east, included East Germany, then the 1990s under Clinton, right to the borders of Russia. But now NATO's expanded even further. Its official role now is to control the global energy system, to control the sea lanes and the pipelines. There was just a conference in Washington a couple of weeks ago led by former Secretary of State Albright, which outlined a global mission for NATO. Well, the idea is NATO should become a U.S.-run global intervention force. Now, there's conflict over this. Europeans aren't all that happy about spending the money and so on. The U.S. is attacking them for being too nonviolent. In fact, there was an interesting article in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago by Richard Haas, who's head of the Council on Foreign Relations, and kind of an old high-level foreign policy official. The title was "Goodbye Europe. We don't need you anymore. You're not violent enough. You're not willing to pour enough money into serving as our global intervention force, so goodbye Europe." Well, he didn't really mean it. The U.S. means Europe, but it's a sign of tensions. And what happened with NATO is quite instructive. I mean, it's a dramatic illustration of the fact that all of the propaganda of the Cold War was just complete lies. So NATO doesn't disappear. When the Russian hordes disappear, it expands. And it expands in order to make sure that Europe doesn't carry out that dangerous option that you're referring to of becoming an independent force in world affairs, which it could. And NATO is supposed to constrain that. It's a military force run by the U.S. Okay, Europe has choices. It have to accept that path.
A couple of years ago, I sent yourself and Michael Albert, an email about the idea of climate war, militarization, climate war.
Climate war?
Climate war. And the broad idea was there's often been a call by elites like Al Gore and other people like Prince Charles for us all to mobilize, a kind of national mobilization to fight climate change.
That's a very interesting case. Here's a very striking case of the lethal effects of markets. It's a dramatic illustration of the lethal effects of markets. I mean, markets have certain properties. We don't really have a market society. It's kind of like a semi-market society. So the corporate sector knows it can appeal to the state to come along and save it, and it gets into trouble. So it's a state capitalist economy, but it partially has market principles. And those market principles function. So suppose you're the CEO of an energy corporation, or for that matter, suppose you're in the Chamber of Commerce, big business lobby. Well, you have certain interests. As part of your institutional role in a market system, you have to maximize short-term profit. You just have to do that. You don't have any choices. If you decide not to do it, you're out and someone else is in who does do it. So it's not a choice. That means you have to ignore what economists call externalities, the effect of a transaction on others. You have to ignore that. If you pay attention to it, you're out. First of all, it's illegal, but you're also out anyhow, because somebody else will do it. Well, that has consequences. One consequence, incidentally, is the repeated financial crises. They follow almost automatically from the necessity to ignore externalities. The externalities in the case of the financial system are called systemic risk. So like if Goldman Sachs makes a transaction, assuming they're well managed, they have to take into account their own welfare. What will happen to us if the loan goes bad? But they don't take into account and cannot take into account the risk that the whole system will collapse. Okay, that's virtual guarantee of financial crisis. That's why they keep repeating it over and over again and becoming worse and worse. It's not a big secret. You learn it the first term of Econ 101. So you have to ignore externalities. Okay, in the case of systemic risk, okay, it's not an overwhelming problem because the powerful state will step in and rescue you and you end up being richer than before, so we've just seen. But let's take the climate change. The CEOs of corporations and the guys in the Chamber of Commerce and so on, they have to follow the policy ignoring externalities. Well, the externality in this case happens to be the fate of the species. But nobody's going to step in and bail you out. Now, the guys who are making those decisions, and they're doing it. They're running huge propaganda campaigns to try to convince Americans that it's all a little hoax. And they're trying to beat back any legislation that might do anything about it. Put in Copenhagen and so on. Those same people know exactly the same beliefs you do about climate change. They know that it's a serious risk, that it's going to destroy everything they own. It's going to destroy the lives of their grandchildren, or maybe their great-grandchildren. As human beings, they know that. But when they move back to the office, the CEO office, they have to forget that. There they have to keep to the market principle of ignoring the externalities, in this case, the fate of the species. And that's what we're facing. That's why there isn't any legislation, and there isn't any campaign. And there won't be as long as we permit this element of market systems to function.
Do you think it's safe to allow financiers to try and internalize climate change and develop carbon markets, for instance? Is that a greater risk?
If you can figure out a way for the corporations to make money out of dealing with climate change, well, yeah, maybe something will happen. But anything you work out is just still ignoring the externalities. So it's been argued. So, for example, Robin Panel had a couple articles in ZNet, I think, in which he said, look, cap and trade is a horrible proposal. It's the only thing that you can ever ram through a corporate-run system. So go to say, okay, maybe. But as you can see, they don't want it.
Sure.
We're playing with big stakes at this point. It's much worse than the financial crisis. Literally, it's fate of the species. And there are serious institutional reasons, not bad people, not greedy bankers or anything like that. Just people fulfilling the necessary institutional role. That's pretty hard to do. It'll take a lot of work.
What would be the American reaction if Canada were to actually shut down the tar sands? What would be the American reaction if Canada were to actually shut down the tar sands? If Canada were to shut down the tar sands?
If Canada
would shut down the tar sands.
Oh, the tar sands? Well, if the United States wanted them, they'd just conquer Canada. They wouldn't have to go that far because the countries are sufficiently integrated, so Canada would be what the U.S. says. Actually, as you probably know, the United States has tried to conquer Canada ever since 1775. It repeatedly tried to conquer Canada. It was beaten back by a superior British force. That's the only reason why Canada has kind of nominal independence, British deterrent. And finally, the U.S. kind of accepted the border. But since then, through other measures, Canada has become more and more subordinate to the United States. And the business community in Canada is in favor of that. Like, they don't oppose it. They're quite happy to be subordinate, with the U.S. power. And since they pretty much run Canadian politics, they get more and more subordinate. Canada did threaten at one point during the Bush years. It did make a threat to shift its oil exports to China. What happened was there was a case under NAFTA. There was a case brought by Canada against the United States, and Canada won, and the United States told them to shut up. We don't care what the court decides. And Canada was kind of annoyed. So they said, well, okay, if you do that, we'll start sending oil to China, and the United States laughed. And that was the end of that story. Yeah.
Following up on the question about the climate change being an externality and the compulsion.
It's the fate of the species that it's an externality.
Okay, well, okay, yeah, fate of the consequence of climate change. And I'm wondering, is there another market feature apart from the need to maximize profits that's also impinging on the environment, and that is our money system, the fractional reserve banking system, does that require growth? That aspect of the economy require growth in order to maintain the system and avoid collapse.
And there's a lot of kind of internet gossip about the fractional reserve system, and that's somehow a big problem. Ron Paul and those guys feel about it. I don't really believe it. I mean, we can't eliminate the money system. Nobody wants to go back to barter. And the fractional reserve system just means you lend money beyond the liquidity that you have in your pocket, which is the only way to keep an economy functioning. I mean, for whether it's an individual household, most households are running on debt, and they should be. And governments are running on debt, and businesses are running on debt, and somebody's got to provide liquidity for it. Other than that, you'd be constrained. I mean, if you couldn't, say, borrow money to buy a car or send your kids to college or buy a house or something, life would be very constrained. So I don't think that's the problem. There's a lot of talk about it, but I think it's misplaced.
It seems to be getting more and more difficult to have any kind of resistance against Palestine or against Israel, and just as far as like when U.S. activists go over there, they're killed, like Rachel Corrie, and the other day a U.S. activist was blinded on one of the ships. So what kind of role can us in the U.S. play? What kind of resistance do you think is effective towards the situation?
What you describe is accurate, but I think that that's an illustration of the opposite, that it's easier to carry out resistance. Solidarity workers weren't being killed a couple of years ago because there weren't any. There was no solidarity movement. Okay, now there's a solidarity movement, so yeah, you get the Rachel Corrie cases. But that's an illustration of the fact that it's easier to protest. In fact, I know it from personal experience. Others who've been activists for a long time are familiar with it. When you go back a couple of years, I literally had to have police protection if I was giving a talk at MIT, Brown University, let alone anywhere else. I remember cases not many years ago where the Cambridge police insisted on accompanying my wife and me back from a talk at MIT to our car because they'd picked up, they infiltrate all the organizations and they picked up death threats and so on. Well, that's long gone. By now, you give a talk, huge audience, you can't get a hostile question. The mood has just changed. The change in the mood has not reached educated sectors, it's not reached the media, it's not reached the political class, but the options for action are far greater. There is an international solidarity movement. There's a lot of very good, courageous people participating in it, and one of the consequences, you get the Rachel Corries. So yes, it's real, but I think it's an illustration of the fact that the options for protest are much greater.
Like, do you think protests are the best way to go? Like us organizing protests here?
Organized protest is now very much easier than it used to be. And that means other actions too. Well, there are other actions being taken beyond protest. Like, for example, the boycott of products from the occupied territories. It's a very realistic option. A lot of people are doing it. It's a very good thing to do. Actually, there's more that can be done. As you may know, Amnesty International, during the Gaza attack, Amnesty International came out with a report calling on the United States to terminate all arms shipments to Israel because they were illegal under international law. And they didn't add this, but if they could have added, it's illegal under U.S. law. Under U.S. law, you cannot provide arms to a country except for defensive purposes. Well, as I mentioned, these are not defensive purposes. So therefore, U.S. arms to Israel are in fact illegal under American law and also under international law. The solidarity movements could pick that up, and they could say, yeah, okay, let's call for an arms embargo. Let's obey American law. I don't think you can reach the American population with a call for obeying American law. That would be pretty serious for Israel. It would also be serious for American business. But, Lockheed Martin and the rest of them, one of the reasons they love Israel is because whenever the United States provides $3 billion of military aid to Israel, it goes into their pockets. They say that means they sell Israel advanced weaponry,